Alright, so love your neighbor. We have been talking for a few weeks now. The foundation of a lot of this is the basis of what our law, so to speak, is now. What's the basis of our law? In other words, what is right and wrong now? God's character, right? Okay. So it's not the Old Testament law anymore, right? We know that was fulfilled in Christ. But Mom and I were just talking about this again. It's still something where you kind of have to think about a little bit if you've thought about it differently all your life. But this seems to be the most biblical approach, I think, that the law is fulfilled. We don't have to pick and choose, I'll keep this part of the law, but the law is fulfilled. However, some of that law represented the character of God. And so we're going to see overlap. Right? We're going to see similarities in what we are still expected to do in morality. We are to believe is true. It's still based on the character of God. So that's where you have the moral law, as it's called, is still not, we're not under the law, but the moral aspects of the law were based on the character of God. And so that happens to be what we see in the New Testament repeated for us as well, where Christ tells us this is right and this is wrong based on the character of God. So I think starting from that foundation is a huge help. See, last week we talked about this. What is the most important command given in the entire Bible? Good. Love God, and then the second is love others. And this has been repeated a couple times, even seeing some similarities in our Sunday morning series in 1 John, and I believe some of Sunday school as well, in that overlap and that amplification of hear it once, hear it again, hear it a third time. So that's a good thing, and apparently what God wants to be teaching us today at this time. Does morality change from time to time, culture to culture? We talked about this a little bit last time too. What do we decide? Get it all figured out? Remember? It seems like a long time ago, doesn't it?
I don't think it's supposed to change, but it sure bends a lot.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I'm going to have to, there's a book, you guys know Adrian Rogers, right? There's a book called Adrianisms. I think we need some Edisms. I even could fill a book, Ed, I'm pretty sure. That'd be great. It's, practically speaking, it has, right, from what we view of morality, if you want to call it that. If you want to say what the common morality is, has changed. Does right and wrong change? Concretely, no. Practically, it seems to, not that that's right. That doesn't make it right, even though it seems to be accepted that it changes. But that's where we're here to say, wait a minute, what's right, what's biblical, we'll go from there, right? So we started into some little more, I don't know, a little different kind of study than normal last time. We were talking about different ethical systems. Relativistic, what does that word mean? Can someone help us out, kind of catch back up to where we were last week again? What does relativistic mean? Michael, any idea, buddy?
No.
No? No, man. All right. Anyone else?
Changes.
Okay.
Non-absolute.
All right, non-absolute, okay, just changes, right? So relativistic is what we considered last week, and we came up with a couple, well, especially this big word, right? Antinomianism. Meaning there are no moral laws. And so that's pretty common today in our culture, right? Who are you to tell me I'm wrong? And who are you to say you're right? Okay, so there's no moral absolutes, and as such we see things like however many genders you want, and we see you can love whoever you want, and however you want to do it, and we have just a complete just a throwing off of any kind of standard. So that would be the result, really largely, of antinomianism. Does anyone, I don't know if you have any, if you took any notes or anything, does anyone remember what the next one was?
Journalism.
Okay, generalism, okay. Oh, I got problems in here first. There it is, generalists are those who say there are some general laws but no absolute ones. Going back up to the problem of antinomianism, what's the problem with antinomianism? When you say there are no moral laws, what are you doing?
Making it absolute.
You're making an absolute claim. You're saying there are no absolutes, and you're saying that there are absolutely no absolutes. It's kind of ridiculous, right? You're making an absolute claim.
Until whoever that dude is the victim, and all of a sudden he'll change his mind a tad.
That's so true.
Yeah.
That's so true. That changes your perspective, and all of a sudden, man, this is, how can anyone not think this is wrong, right? Yeah, very true. So that would even have a problem 3 of perspective. It's all fine as long as it's in this ethereal, intellectual space. As soon as it's practical and it's affecting me, I think most people are going to change their tunes. What was the problem 2? If we say there are no moral laws, then my truth can be true, and your truth can be true, even if they're conflicting. And it just doesn't make sense, right? If you say your idea that murder is wrong is absolutely true, or is right, and I say that there's nothing wrong with murder, then what you're saying, if there's no moral laws, then I'm right and you're right, but we're saying contradictory things, it doesn't work. Right? So there are some intellectual problems with antinomianism. Generalism, and the generalist says there are some general or pragmatic laws, but no absolute ones. Right? So basically what we're saying is, it's not what we're saying, but the generalist is going to say, whatever brings the greatest good to the greatest number of people. And that could be one thing in one culture and another in another culture. That could be one thing a few years ago and it could be a different thing now. Just whatever, it's fluid. And it's not so much based on there is right and wrong, but there is something that works and something that doesn't. Okay, so you might be able to run your car on ethanol for a while. And it'll work. But you might find out that after a little while, some things don't work quite as well. Maybe that's a poor illustration, but basically it's just saying whatever works. You're not saying it's right and wrong, it just happens to work for our culture right now. For the greatest number of people. Problem number 1, what about the minority? You're saying they don't matter, right? It might be wrong for them, but it's right for the majority, so sorry about your luck. That's basically what you're saying. So there's some problems, kind of like Ed, what you were saying there too. As long as you're in the majority, you're fine.
Well, here for a while, we've gone for the minority leading the majority, which is kind of stupid. How are we on the same place?
Yeah.
Right.
And really you can see that because of that, what happens every 4 years? Politically speaking and morally speaking, as much as they can influence and are, to some extent, influencing morality, you have a pendulum swing back and forth, and it's still, as mad as we are when it's not what we agree with, and as happy as we are when it is what we agree with, there's some extent where we have to realize we're really still not getting anywhere. Because it's not based on anything real, or we're not saying there are moral absolutes still, although I'm thankful for any time we get our swing back. But we can all see through it too, though, right? And we can see how fragile it is. It's not like everything's fixed now, even if we agree with some of the things, because it's just there till someone else changes it, because we don't have any depth beyond that. What does generalism typically move towards? Can we talk about it a little bit? First one. Anyone volunteer to say antinomianism? Alright. So generally, can you see how that would make sense? If we're not saying there are any moral absolutes, just some things that work, well, over time it just tends to lean towards, you're going to end up saying there are no moral absolutes, or just nothing matters. So it doesn't stay consistently true to their to their law. It's pragmatic, which means it doesn't work now, fine. Guess what? It's not going to work later, and so you're going to change because it's not based on the absolutes. So tonight, I hope you're not going to be too bored with some of this, like more the intellectual side of things right now, because it can be dry sometimes. But I do think it's helpful for us to think through and to know where we're coming from, and ultimately why we believe what we believe. I think we've had too many Christians go through the motions and know what to believe but not why, and then we find out, oh, that doesn't last very long. You know, about a generation is all it takes for them to be completely gone, you know, if they don't know why. So we're trying to help us think through why as well. So we had relativistic ethical systems, which said there are no moral what? No moral absolutes, right? Nothing set, nothing that's unchanging. So now we have absolutist ethical systems. What do you think these four ethical systems are going to have in common? Probably they believe there is an absolute. All right, we're doing all right so far. There's something at least that supposedly doesn't change. Okay, so all I'm going to have up here for you tonight is just a table. It's not next. A question for you to think about as we get there, I guess. How can we communicate to a people a system of absolute morality without coming across as arrogant? Have you ever found this to be troubling or difficult? Have you ever had to make a stand and say, no, this is wrong, but they just see you as arrogant? You ever had that? How in the world how do you communicate absolute morality? There is right and wrong without coming across as arrogant. I'm curious to hear, this is too open-ended to be a good question, but we know each other, it's all right. Do you have any examples of how that has been true in your life, a time when you might have noticed it? I know this is on the spot, so if you don't have anything, that's fine. Do you have any examples of when you might have noticed this, and maybe how you responded, or how you think you can answer this? Anyone have any examples that pop into your mind right now? Like I said, I know it was very on the spot, so if not, it's all right.
It was quite a few years ago, I was talking to someone about it, and I kind of got them to agree with partial standard. It was easy once they made that bridge. I don't know how to,
Mm-hmm.
but instead of me just saying, this is it, and come across that way, it got them to kind of get there first.
Okay.
And not really trick them into it, but
But kind of.
yeah. But when they realized
Yeah.
they agreed that there were some absolutes,
Mm-hmm.
then it's easier to make that bridge. Like where those absolutes come from, then if you believe this, then it doesn't logically transfer to this,
Mm-hmm.
because they didn't realize they had those absolutes. Then once you got into some of it logically, they're okay. So it was easier to get there together than it was just to
Okay.
say.
Yeah. Well, that's a good recommendation there too. Not just start off as this is my absolute, deal with it. Trust me or believe it. You know, it's wait, you have some absolutes too. Getting them to agree that they do, and go from there. It's a good recommendation, and can save you from coming across as, oh, you're the one who has, who has these absolutes. I'm sure they're going to say, oh, you have absolutist ethical systems. I had that argument all the time. I remember, Dave, do you remember us doing that in church? Not ethical system like this, but do you remember years ago, when we were talking about music? And we do you remember I played some music in the church as well? I don't know if you remember. I don't know how many of you were here at that point. You remember, Bree?
I wasn't there, but I remember you took one.
Okay. But we played some music, and there was some that I couldn't bring myself to play here. But the goal was to say, regardless of if you don't think you have limits, you have limits. Everyone's going to have limits on what they think is acceptable in the normal life. Everyone's going to have limits on what they feel is acceptable in the church. Now, we might disagree on what that ends up looking like exactly, but kind of like you were doing, my goal was to say, we all do have a limit, or we do have a standard at some point where we do make a decision. Now, work through what is it, right? You can't just step back and say, I don't have to make a decision. And morally, I think that's a good way to approach it too. You also have moral absolutes. You have to make a decision on these things. Then what's it going to be? Maybe that's a good way to think through it. Thanks, Mike. Anyone else have a situation or an answer for this?
Well, this is kind of weird, but I'm not much on pro football or anything, but the Super Bowls, you tend to see with all the hoopla you'll take a look at. 20 years ago, halftime shows kind of made sense. Now you don't know what planet they're from. And that's the time to go get something to eat. Yeah.
Yep.
It's a whole different thing.
Yep. We find that to be tough too, and then when we have friends over who don't think anything about it anyway, it's tough to know what that balance is, because you can easily come across as arrogant if you're not careful. Understanding sometimes they don't know what you're talking about, right? They have never heard anything. They've never even thought that there could be anything wrong with anything. And so you do have to work through sometimes what seems maybe obvious to us. And I think that's what we have to be careful of. I'm thinking at work, it's very different than the things you can say here and the things I can say in the pulpit, from the pulpit, I can say more boldly to you all because we know each other. And we have some kind of common understanding. Can't say the same thing always the same way. I mean, hopefully I'm not saying change the truth, but you have to change your approach when someone is not coming from the same perspective, right? Because we are in a world that is from another world a lot of times. It's very true.
There is a place called Hort.
You found it. It's closer than you thought too, isn't it? All right. Well, that's something you can think about there too. And we do want to come across graciously, but truthfully too. So here's the table. Okay, here's the last 4 systems that we need to think through tonight. Again, I know it's perhaps a little drier, but I think still helpful. So it's a little smaller up there, and I realized that gray was not the best choice to put in the in the table down at the bottom. So I'll read everything too. You don't have to quote. You don't have to write it all down. If it's a help, do it. That's great. But the first thing, okay, is all of these 4. They're going to be based on at least one absolute. Okay, so they at least agree there is at least one objective standard. There's something that doesn't change one way or another. Okay. For instance, the Judeo-Christian world is based on what we consider divine revelation, right? The Judeo-Christian world is based on the Bible, what we consider there was divine revelation, information from God passed on. Specifically, evangelical Christians, we base our ethic right here. We say this is an objective standard. We say, not everyone that says they're Christian says this is an objective standard, but for argument's sake, we say that it is an objective standard. And so really there's a lot of agreement within what the Bible believing community about many of the issues we're going to deal with. Sometimes we have more of a debate on how we apply these in society. So here are the 4, okay? By the way, most Christians are going to fall in one of the final 3. Okay, that's where most Christians are going to find themselves. So the first one is situationalism. Okay? What does that seem to imply? That morals, what? What does it imply? Seem to imply about morals?
That it would change.
That it would change based on the situation, right? It's true. That is what happens. What is different about situationalism, though, is it does claim one ethic or one moral, and that is the moral or the absolute of love. Okay? That everything is based on love. Now, does that sound at least somewhat biblical? It should, right? Why should that sound biblical?
It's God's love.
God is love, so we're based on the unchanging nature of God. So that's a good place. What else?
2 greatest commandments, it said love God, love others.
Okay. So we have a commonality between those 2 greatest commandments, love God and love others. So it sounds like we're maybe heading the right way. There was one of its our best known proponents, his name is Joseph Fletcher. He wrote a book called Situation Ethics. And he says that this is kind of between the extremes of legalism and antinomianism. All right, now let's see if we can remember what that means. How would you define these 2 extremes? What is antinomianism? Remember? There's no moral law, no absolutes. What is legalism? It's all unchanging law, right? Okay, so what he's saying is this finds the balance between no law and all law. So whereas the antinomians have no laws, the legalists have laws for everything, right? And so here he feels like he has found the balance, and there's this one law. They're going to quote Jesus, right? But what did Jesus actually say? How many laws? In a way, you can make an argument that there wasn't just 2, or it wasn't just one law, there were 2, love God and love others. But they both hinged on love, so we can agree with that. They see situationists, they see people as having real value. Okay, people have value, but things only have value because people value them. So they're saying people matter more than things. Is that a good thing?
Yes.
Sure. We need to believe people are more valuable than things. And so because people have value, they should be treated lovingly. We agree with that as well. Situationists seek for what is practical for love's sake. We might start scratching our heads at that point. So situationalism, it does have, it says love is the one absolute. The problem is it's also relativism, because it's saying every ethical idea is related to love. It's all changed based on how it is related to love, okay? And what ends up happening is love turns out to be an empty concept. Love turns out to mean nothing, basically, or everything. Because you can change it, you can phrase, this is because I love whatever, and you can change that to make it work for anything you do, right? If you can say, I can take this from you because I love my family, right? My family needs it more than you, so because I love my family, I'm going to take this from you that wasn't mine. You see a problem with that? Okay? Personally, you can get that a little bit more personal too and say, I can do what I want because I love me, or it's all based on love. You can end up making that one absolute of love be very relativistic and kind of mean whatever you want, is the danger. They don't define love in absolute terms, okay? What about the dog on a chain? Something close to my heart, okay? What some might think of as fine and normal and loving because we love this dog, some others might think of as cruel. Do you agree with that? Mm-hmm. I might think of a little bit of both. Right? What one might think of as loving, another might think as cruel. Now what? You see how that one moral absolute of love all of a sudden isn't so absolute. It's in fact pretty relative, depending on your position, your perspective, and how you're being influenced by this. So can you see how situationalism, it really isn't very stable, right? And not necessarily very practical, because it can be twisted any way you want it. I think this is also, we can see some similarities in our culture today. A lot of times we'll see, well, this is because of love, you know? And then you'll have commercials saying, love is love, right? You've seen those too? Why is that? Something that seems that is so pure. God is love. They can take something so pure and so right and holy, and they can end up attributing it to something that's evil and wicked. It's because if you still don't have any true absolutes, where you're not defining love in any absolute way, you can still take that one absolute, make it relative to whatever you want to make it, right? So, that's situationalism, where they claim to be an absolutist, but maybe we might question that a little bit, okay? But at least, and we're heading the right way, because at least they say there's something that matters, okay? So, this is definitely an end justifies the means situation, okay? Now let's look at the next one, okay? We'll stir up some questions probably with the last three. Unqualified absolutism, okay? In other words, there's no limits to this one. Unqualified, you don't have to make any exceptions, you don't have to say unless anything, this is just absolutism, unqualified, okay? The, up here on the screen says, there are many absolutes that never conflict with each other. When I say absolutes, and we know what we're talking about as far as morality, what is morality based on? Remember what we said?
God's nature.
God's nature. Does God have just one aspect to his nature? Would you agree that there are many aspects to his nature? So if the morals are based on the aspects of God's nature, and there are many aspects of God's nature, then there are many absolutes. So name some absolutes. Love. We just talked about that one, right? Justice. What else? Mercy. Grace. Truth. Holiness. A lot of the characteristics of God, attributes of God. You see, okay, there could be many of these things that matter. Not just love, that's part of it. I'm not saying it's not the most important, I'm not saying it's even maybe the key, but there are many aspects of, many absolutes. And the unqualified absolutists will say there are many absolutes that never conflict with each other, right? They want to be consistent, and they're going to argue that God won't allow people to be in situations where they would ever have to break an absolute moral norm. Okay? And that'd be nice. All right. This is one of the most widely held approaches within Christianity as well. Okay? Where there is right and wrong all the time. And I think already just from that description or definition, you can see why that should be probably, or probably would be one of the most widely held. So some of the philosophers, theologians, Augustine, going way back, coming up a little bit more current, Immanuel Kant, and Charles Hodge. So you're getting a little bit more current, and Hodge has a systematic theology, and that's very well known and a great work and a help to the church. So just for your curiosity's sake. So what they're going to say in unqualified absolutism is there seems to be a moral conflict. There's actually no conflict, it just seems like there is, but there's really no conflict. So, for instance, here's where we get a little tricky. If you were told, if you were asked, and depending on your answer, someone was going to murder someone or not. Okay? Is there someone in your house? Because I'm going to kill them. And you said, can't lie, yes there is, my daughter's in the house. You see where there's a moral conundrum now. What does God want you to do? Does he want you to tell the truth? Or does he want you to allow a murder? Are there any, is anyone struggling with how we handle this?
Yeah, wait a minute, I'll be back with you just a second. I'll get my 44.
That's the best answer. It really is. I mean, that probably solves a lot of these problems, honestly. We're gonna deal with.
Well, people aren't supposed to murder people, but the person who murders people, was that unintentionally, if it was on purpose? The fact that we knock him out isn't murder. He didn't give the victim a second chance.
Yeah, if it's, and we're probably gonna have to deal with some of these things as far as what is murder and killing, like self-defense, like those are things we have to answer, right? And thankfully there's an answer for that. And thankfully God understands that. And yet some of this is hopefully hypothetical. You know, hopefully we'll never have to deal with some of these, but in a less extreme sense, you might have to deal with some of these a little more frequently than we even think. What would the unqualified absolutist say? How would that response need to be? What would that response need to be? Based on the unqualified absolutist, what would he say? How would he answer that no murderer?
You'd say, yes, there's someone there, and then God wanted to protect him, he would.
Okay, right? So did you hear that? You'd say, okay. So they're going to come from the approach that God is only going to reward good behavior. Since lying is a sin, you have to tell the truth and leave the results to God. Right? Okay. Hold on to some of your judgment on some of these. Okay? I want us to be able to think through all three of these together. And then we might even think through them this week and go back. Okay? This would be, I'm curious to hear what you think when you have time to think about it as well. Immanuel Kant taught that an action is intrinsically either good or evil. In other words, a lie is always a lie. Okay? It can't ever be a good thing in one situation and a bad in another. Since God is truth and can never lie, neither should we, right? Let's think through some positive aspects. I'm not gonna give my answer for any of these yet. I'm just gonna give some pluses and minuses. Okay? Can you see any strengths of unqualified absolutism? Let's see if you come up with any. What are some strengths of this? We're going to find strengths and negatives for the last three of these, by the way.
Well, basically it's a good idea to have the idea of an absolute. But there's a lot of different conditions, and does this dress make me look fat? I want a truthful answer,
That's a perfect illustration.
Yeah.
That is fantastic.
So, you gotta temper some of this.
So that might be one of the things that comes up a little bit more than I'm going to kill someone if you tell me the truth, right? Okay. Yeah.
But
Right.
there might result in.
But both might result in death.
Yeah, you
So-
might get fed,
Oh man. But you are right, they are based on absolutes. That's a good thing, right? We want a morality that's based on absolutes. I think we should. If you are biblical at all, you want some morality based on absolutes. I think we can see the Bible requiring that. So that's definitely a strength here, right? It's based on God's unchanging character. So that's a good thing. It's based on moral absolutes. It's also, can you think of anything else? Oh, I don't catch up.
I think it would very much be trusting in the sovereignty of God,
Mm-hmm.
and like you said, leave the results to God.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, good. God is able to do what he wants. If he wants it, it's different than he can. Okay.
I've always had a problem with some of that, to just rely that God will save me, and if you do something terrifically stupid, he may just go ahead and take you out because you're dumb.
Yeah.
It just, you can push the limit.
Yeah.
It might happen, but the odds are
Not
pretty
in
much
favor.
against it, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you're too
There
foolish, he'd take you out maybe.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we have to, there are circumstances where what we expect of God, maybe we're being a little presumptuous too. One of the books that the kids had to read was The Hiding Place. I don't know if you ever read The Hiding Place. But what would you do if the Nazis came and asked if you were hiding Jews? Would you tell them, yes, we are? What about even just hiding them to begin with? That's illegal. So should they have not hid? Actually, the kids did. I think some of them did their essay on whether they should have or not. Should you lie to them? You see the predicament that.
Well, what makes you think that you won't be penalized greatly regardless of what you say? If you say no and I've seen them, you're
Right.
gone too, so, whatever,
This is not a simple answer
right.
necessarily, right? And it's all fine when we're stepping away saying, okay, purely theoretically, okay, always do this, lie is always wrong. Well, what about situations like World War II Germany, Poland, you know? How about you ever watch the old BJ film, The Printing? It's about smuggling Bibles in Russia, I believe, wasn't it? It was illegal. Should they have printed Bibles? Should they have smuggled them? You know, and should you lie about it? Well, all of a sudden, you know, what about missionaries in foreign countries? Should you say you're going in to train nationals on how to make a cup of coffee? Or should you tell them, I'm a missionary? Right? These are real life problems for some of them too, with real life consequences. Positive aspects of unqualified absolutism, strong view of morality based on the nature of God, on God's sovereignty. Also motivated by rule rather than result. You ever gotten in trouble when you try to manipulate results and you're basing your decision on what you think will happen rather than on what's right and wrong? You ever got in trouble with that? Most of us probably have. It's a dangerous game to play. It's a good thing to be governed by rule rather than result. So I think that's a strength as well. And then I think logically, if God expects his creatures to be holy, do you think then would it be possible for, should it be possible for us to not sin? Should God give us an outcome that it's either right or wrong? You don't have to sin in a situation where there's really no choice between moral absolutes. There's only one. Okay. Negative aspects. Would you agree that perhaps this could promote legalism? Well, this is right all the time, and you're wrong if you disagree with me. You see how it can promote that? Okay. When you're always trying to focus on the rightness or wrongness of actions without regard for anything, any higher, if you want to say higher, and again, hold your judgment, okay? Because some of these things sound maybe like they sound, and maybe they don't, okay? But if you're always trying to focus on the rightness or wrongness of action without regard for any higher one, they can promote a legalistic mindset. Can you think of the Pharisees in this? When were they focused on a legalistic mindset and they missed the higher purpose or goal? Remember when the disciples were gathering corn, they were gathering food to eat on the Sabbath. And we're supposed to work on the Sabbath, and they missed the fact that you have to eat, or maybe healing on the Sabbath, and they lost the view of caring for people, loving people, because they were holding to this rigid law, right? So I'm not saying pass a judgment on whether this is completely right or wrong yet, but you see where at least it can lead, okay? What if honesty and some other moral absolute were in conflict? So, for instance, which sin is greater, the sin of lying to save a life, or the lack of mercy in allowing a murder or a rape or something? Which one's worse? If you knowingly allow something to happen, that's also condemned in Scripture. If you're allowing sin to happen, you know it's happening, and you're not doing anything when you could, that is also wrong. But so is lying. So we're in a predicament, right? Can you think of any time where God's people were saved by a lie? Rahab's a perfect example of that, right? So God judged Rahab because she lied. I just lied. I'm sorry. God rewarded Rahab. Perhaps we didn't see everything. Perhaps God says, oh, okay, Rahab, you got away with it this time, but I don't feel like that was how it went down. I don't see that hinted at in Scripture. There's a lot that we don't know, and narratives are tough. Because sometimes it's just, yes, this happened. Okay. But it seems as if she did the right thing. by lying to the guards who were trying to hunt down and kill the spies, right? Doesn't it? Would you agree that it seemed like she did the right thing? And that she's rewarded in the Hall of Faith for doing what? She's not rewarded in spite of what she did. She's rewarded for what she did. That is why we look to her, and that's why Hebrews includes her in the Hall of Faith. And it's for that, for what she did to those spies. And that's a conflicting dilemma, right? It's a conflicting issue of she did a good thing in saving their lives, but she did a bad thing in lying about it. So what do we do with that? I think unqualified absolutism disregards or denies that there are any dilemmas. And I think if you think through it a little bit, there are some possible moral dilemmas where more than one absolute is at play at one time. And also, Immanuel Kant said that every act is either right or wrong all the time. Do you agree with that? Is killing always right or always wrong? Ed, is it always right or always wrong? Typically, murder is wrong, right? Are there instances where killing someone is right?
Well, sometimes the killing is not murder.
Right. And so, thus, is right, right? Okay, how about, let's make it a little bit more interesting too. A toddler plays with a gun and shoots someone, kills someone. Do you hold that toddler morally responsible for what they did? No one's going to do that, right? Why not? Is morality always right or always wrong? You see? Is the intent, does the intent have anything to do with it? Jesus said the intent has everything to do with it, right? So maybe there's something like that in play, perhaps? How about a dog that steals a bite of food? Is he sinning? Can dogs sin? If the act is always wrong, if an act is always sinful, then however that act is done is sinful, right? So if the act itself is always sinful, then a dog sins and a cat sins, right? When they tear up your shower curtain, all right? So I don't think we're going to go take a dog to trial. Or a toddler in an unfortunate incident. You're not going to take them to trial, right? How about this? Let me go through a couple of these quickly because we're definitely not going to finish everything tonight. Is a sin of omission, can it be as bad as a sin of commission? There are things we're supposed to do and you don't. Is that wrong? Right, it's wrong, right? Okay. Sins of omission can be just as bad as sins of commission. So, if you don't prevent a murder or something else, is that a sin? I think typically we're going to say yes. If it's within your power to prevent it, then you don't. God judges, in fact, He judges a lack of mercy very severely. A lack of helping the poor, the widow, and he judges that very severely. So I think He would see that as a sin of omission. So if that's a sin, and lying is a sin, which one's worse? Man, this is tough, right?
Probably depends on the situation. I mean,
Okay.
not everything is absolute.
Sounds like perhaps you're not leaning towards the unqualified absolutism. James 4:17 tells us that whoever knows to do right and doesn't do it, to him it is sin. So there is a very clear understanding that not doing something when you know you should or could can be sinful, okay? Perhaps you might even be able to make the argument that not doing something could even be worse. Okay. So, all right. Jesus, Paul, and many of the disciples, they faced real moral dilemmas. Okay? Jesus broke the Sabbath, technically, to them at times. Right? Even Augustine, who was a proponent of unqualified absolutism, he admitted there are certain divine exceptions to laws, such as when God commanded Abraham to what? Kill his son. Wouldn't you call that murder? Couldn't you call that murder? No, we call it sacrifice and then it's fine. But you would call that murder. That wasn't self-defense. That was not a time of war. Now, did he do it? No, so we don't have to think about it. But did Abraham have a moral dilemma as he was walking up that mountain? Had he decided he was going to go through with it? Yes, he had. Was he sinning and obeying God? Okay.
So Abraham was an unqualified absolutist?
It seems like it, doesn't it? No, actually, yeah, he decided his dilemma was only obey God, that there was no other one, that he must have had an apparent dilemma, that murdering his son was just an apparent wrong, it really wasn't wrong, because he was willing to do it. But I think maybe we just don't know what all was going on in his brain. Once any exceptions are made, then this unqualified absolutism kind of starts to fall apart a little bit. Charles Hodge, the theologian that also proposes this, says, a statement is a lie only in a context in which the truth is expected. Okay, it's not a lie if they know you're lying. Basically, I think is what he's saying. Well, apparently even they are saying, I can see some holes in this, that perhaps there are seeming conflicts we can't resolve. Okay? Now, if your head's spinning, I understand. Okay. All right. Whatever Christian ethic we choose should be able to work for all situations. Okay? Right? Do we agree with that? Wherever we end up, we're not going to finish tonight. Wherever we end up, it ought to work for everything, or it's no good. You can't say this works most of the time, but I don't know about the rest, so we just won't worry about it. That's not being very intellectually honest. So whatever we decide, it needs to work for all of it. So it seems like perhaps this is not able to deal with every issue. Let me give you a couple more things to think about, and then I'm going to introduce the other two, and we'll have to just deal with them next week. Okay? But I do want to give you enough to be thinking about it a little bit, so hopefully we'll get some more discussion next week. But consider this, if still concerning unqualified absolutism, is there always a right and always a wrong? All right, you borrowed a gun from someone who wants it back, and you told them to give it back to them. Your friend's angry when they want it back, and you know why, and you know who they're angry about, and you know how angry they are. Do you give them the gun back? You said you would.
I loaned it to Charlie. That's lying too.
That's lying too, yep.
But he knows he's lying.
Yeah, that's true. He knows his lies, he's not lying. But do you see the moral dilemma?
Just melt time.
It'll get there when you're cooled down. All right, how about this one? Another Rahab-like situation. Moses. What does that have to do with a moral dilemma? Do you remember the Hebrew midwives? What did they tell the Egyptians? Oh, these women are really fit. They just had the baby and everything's fine before we even get there. Was that true? No. Did God seem to punish them for that? Or did he look on them favorably for that? Okay. What would telling the truth have done? Telling the truth for the midwives would have resulted in a lot of babies being murdered, right? How about Miriam? Maybe you could argue she didn't technically lie, but she lied. I mean, she wasn't always truthful. You know what I tell my kids? Not telling the whole truth is the same as telling a lie, right? Except in Miriam's case, and then she was just being wise. It's kind of how we look at it sometimes. How about this? you see on the news there's a criminal, you fill in the extreme definition of that, okay? That's loose in your area. You're in your driveway and a strange man fitting a description walks up and asks if there's someone else in your home. What do you tell him?
Just the sheriff.
In my 44. Okay. I don't think any Christian is going to argue that the situationalist is right. That it's just all about love. So I think we can see through the holes of that. Perhaps we've been used to thinking unqualified absolutism, and maybe you've struggled with what does that mean for these moral predicaments. Okay? Maybe we're still right there. Maybe we'll consider something else as well. I just want to mess with your minds a little bit, and we're going to just introduce the next two. We'll deal with them next week. Okay? So conflicting absolutism says there are many absolutes that sometimes conflict with each other, and it's always wrong to disobey any of them. So in the hiding place situation, they disobeyed the government and they hid Jews and lied about it. What this says is there are many absolutes, such as truth, that were in conflict with love and mercy, right? You see how those two are conflicting at that point when they're being questioned and interrogated, okay? At that point, truth and love and mercy are in conflict. And this is acknowledging they are in conflict, and one of them, and they're both going to be wrong to do, to violate. It's wrong to turn them over, and it's wrong to lie. So you choose which one you want to have to confess later. Okay?
Well, to me, that there was the line. If evil was on the other side of it, then,
Yeah. You know, I think probably most of us would look at the Germans and the Poles that were hiding the Jews and were sometimes dying for them as heroes. As we have to think about the morality of it, I think that becomes a little tougher, and I think there's some aspect where we have empathy in that way. What I want to try to have us do is think biblically about it too, and make sure, are we justified or not? Are we right, or are we just emotional people? Okay? I think there is a biblical answer for it, and I think even is going to lean towards this latter two. Okay? Even one of the first ones. But tonight, I guess I'm trying to make sure we understand there are sometimes some moral dilemmas. And we would be wise, if we were approached with it, we would be wise to think through our response, not just respond. Okay? If God is all-knowing, and if all sin matters to him, then it should matter to us if we're sinning or not, and what we believe and what we do. So here's one that's saying, okay, go ahead and lie and just confess it later. Because it's a sin, but confess it. The last one, the graded absolutism. There are many absolutes that sometimes conflict with each other. Sounds very similar to the prior one, right? Truth, love, and mercy are conflicting. What do? This graded absolutism says, and it is always right to follow the higher law. Okay? So, which is the higher law? To love and protect a life, or to lie to a murderer? That approach is saying there is a higher law that you need to lean towards, you need to yield to. Now, I don't know about you, but this presents some tough questions if we're willing to just say what is biblical, what's right. I know what I want to say, but it also is kind of hard to comprehend and kind of hard to say, am I being biblical, or am I just being, am I just thinking more than I'm believing? So these are some things I'm going to leave you with tonight, okay? And I would like for you to think about, I know you're not going to, this isn't all you're going to think about all week, but hopefully it'll come back up another time or two, and if you're not too mad at me for bringing up some of these ethical questions, hopefully you'll be back next week and we'll try to figure out biblically what the answer is because this, again, is gonna set the stage for other difficult ethical dilemmas that we need to have an opinion about, and have not an opinion as much as we need to be on God's side of it, as much as we can, so. All right, so situationalism, there's only one absolute, and that's love. I think we saw through some of the facade of that, where love can end up being, it can be relative anyway, if you're not gonna define it absolutely. The unqualified absolutist is gonna say, there's only one wrong, never lie, no matter what the consequences. There's never a conflict, actually, there's always only one right thing to do, there's no dilemma. So if someone pays for it, if 1 million people die because of your lie, so be it. Okay, that's the idea. Conflicting absolutism, there are conflicts, and it's wrong to disobey either of them. So if you're gonna choose one, confess it, because it's a sin. The other one is saying there are these conflicts, but it's not a sin to have to choose one if you choose the highest one, okay? So, we're all clear as mud, right? Isn't that what Pastor Joe used to say? Clear as mud? I remember that right? Like I said, I'm not trying to annoy you with just bringing up questions, and hopefully I'm not, but I am trying to make you think and pray about it, and think through Scripture about it, and we'll come back next Sunday and we'll have the world figured out. Okay? Let's pray. Father, thank you for another night tonight. Help us to be able to think through these tough decisions, these tough concepts biblically and in a way that honors you, Lord. I pray you would help us to come together in a helpful way next week, and be able to continue discussing this and seeking your wisdom. Lord, I believe I can speak for all of us, Lord. We want to be on your side of these things. We want to be right, we want to be biblical, and I pray you would help us to do that. Thank you for each one that's here and their willingness to think through these things, even when they're challenging to our minds. In Jesus' name. All right.